Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Exploring the State of Corporate Reputation. Today's presentation will be given by Jason McGrath and Trent Ross. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Jason McGrath, Senior Vice President, Head of Corporate Reputation. Jason, the floor.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Today, we're going to be talking about the state of corporate reputation and the findings from our most recent Reputation Council. I'll be presenting with my colleague, Trent Ross, who is our Global Chief Research Officer, and I am the head of US Corporate Reputation for Ipsos, helping our clients to explore where they stand in the minds of stakeholders, perceptions and drivers of reputation, and how to more effectively communicate and engage with key stakeholders. Our Reputation Council study is in its 15th sitting, and this is a study we conduct annually with senior communicators globally. Each year, we interview approximately 150 senior communicators at global organizations to explore the latest trends and issues and understand the impacts to reputation over time. Today, what we'll be talking about are key findings from this latest report. Survey fieldwork and discussions that took place were conducted earlier this year, from January until about June globally, and the findings have just recently been released. Today, we'll be exploring perceptions of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on companies, diversity and inclusion, internal communications, and ESG. We look forward to any questions you may have and to any follow-up discussions after. We'll start with COVID-19. And in our discussions with senior communicators, we explored the impact of the pandemic to their business, to the communications function, and to a number of other areas. And we wanted to start by just understanding the role of corporate purpose in the pandemic, and what the role of a corporation is in society, and whether business can be purposeful and still make a profit. And what we've found from these discussions with senior level communicators is that the response to COVID-19, as you see here in a quote, has aligned well with companies trying to find a balance between business priorities and wider societal need. As I'm sure many of you experienced in your own businesses and in your day-to-day, the pandemic had a major impact and continues to. It quickly resulted in employees working remotely, needing to connect teams across geographic boundaries and in virtual ways. And perhaps had no greater impact than on the way our teams engage with each other and the ways in which a company communicates with its employees. And what we saw in the response from senior communicators in the study was that the response to the pandemic was perceived at the time that we were conducting this fieldwork to be led by business, that business community had been taking a lead in tackling COVID-19. As you can see here, 7 in 10 of our council members agreed with this statement. And it's the business community that was able to really react quickly, to be able to be agile during this period of discovering how we work differently, how we engage with our employees in a different way, how we provide our products and services to customers and clients in a different way. So there was this overwhelming sense, and there continues to be, that the business community has taken a lead. Now that varies by industry though. What we found when we asked which industries in particular were seen as doing a very good job at addressing the pandemic. At the time that we were conducting this fieldwork, predominantly as vaccines were beginning to roll out here in the US and globally, the pharmaceutical industry, of course, was getting a lot of credit for its response to the pandemic. But across industries, we saw a lot of positivity in the way that companies were behaving and companies were responding to the pandemic. In fact, the areas that we saw the lowest agreement with this was in oil and gas and in social media companies. But across the board, we saw a lot of agreement that different industries were responding very well and having a positive impact in the response to the pandemic. This really caused companies, of course, to refocus on internal communications. 4 out of 5 of our council members said the COVID-19 pandemic had greatly impacted their team or function, many indicating that it required new ways of engaging, new ways of motivating employees. And of course, as most of us have seen, a new focus on employee well-being, focus on mental health and the sense of balance as many companies were trying to adjust to virtual work for an entire workforce. And of course, as we think about what's next, it is likely that we will still continue to see this focus on internal communications and how we adjust and our workforces adjust to a return to the office as we emerge from the pandemic. So there is plenty more, of course, on the COVID-19 pandemic, and plenty more to come as we continue to emerge from the pandemic and companies continue to evolve, implement new policies, implement new procedures, new ways of working. And we will continue to explore this both with our Rep Council participants, as well as through additional research being conducted by Ipsos. The second topic we explored in the Reputation Council study was around diversity and inclusion. Of course, social programs, sustainability programs, all growing in importance for companies. We wanted to understand specifically with regards to diversity and inclusion, how companies were implementing new policies, reacting to societal demands, and what they were doing in these spaces. What we found first is that communicators and the businesses that they work for are very much committed to progressive social agendas. And progress on some goals is being made, but some of our respondents do see actions as lagging behind the words, many indicating that companies are making a lot of promises, are talking about social purpose, but may not be doing enough in terms of action plans against that purpose. Overwhelmingly, however, 96% of our Reputation Council participants this year agree that companies do benefit from embracing diversity and inclusion, by creating more inclusive workforces, by having a more diverse background of employees. And so it's clear here, of course, in this quote by one of our Reputation Council participants, good intentions must be backed up by evidence of action or a clear plan on where progress will be made. It is really about taking action against objectives and goals, not just communicating those objectives and goals. And that's really where the value is in diversity and inclusion initiatives for companies. And there is a sense amongst these respondents that there is a significant role for business to lead and tackle D&I initiatives. When we asked our respondents, do you agree or disagree that it is the role of government, not business, to tackle issues of diversity and inclusion? You can see that overwhelmingly our respondents disagree with that statement, that there is a key role for business to play when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Only 1 in 10 say that they agree with that it is the role of government. What we found actually is when we split this data, there is even stronger disagreement, meaning that business does have a clear role to play in emerging markets as compared to developed nations. The only respondent who agreed to this statement that governments, not business, should be tackling these issues come from developed markets, though it is a vast minority of respondents who agreed with that. So a strong majority do believe business can and must lead, and that we're seeing this demand from new generations of employees, from employees of different backgrounds. It really is across the workforce that there is a role for business to lead in diversity and inclusion initiatives. However, some companies are perceived as holding back, and the communicators that we spoke to this year, they agree that there is an expectation for companies to take action on diversity and inclusion issues. However, 62% of the communicators we spoke to say that they believe their company hesitates on diversity and inclusion for fear of saying the wrong thing. Now, clearly, in some instances, there may be a say-do gap. What a company says and the commitments that it makes, those must be followed by action. We only gain credibility with our employees and with other stakeholders by conducting the work that needs to be done, by putting action to the commitments that have been made. There is a fear of severe backlash that a company's commitments perhaps may not go far enough, perhaps in some instances could be perceived as going too far to what society is ready for or the employee base demands. And of course, there's a knowledge gap with employees and with other stakeholders. So there is this fear right now amongst communicators of saying the wrong thing. And so again, it is about learning, identifying authentic and credible actions that can be taken to address diversity and inclusion, and to ensure that action is being taken in collaboration, of course, with the workforce and with other key stakeholders. And of course, it's important that companies respond to issues meaningfully. It's important that a company, of course, stays true to strategy to best address the company's needs, short-term and long-term. And so therefore, it's not expected in the minds of communicators that they need to respond to everything. It is about identifying the issues that have a potential impact on operations, a potential impact on the employee base, and identifying prioritization on what a company is expected to and must address versus where it can lean on other organizations, whether it be industry groups, community organizations, and others to help address certain issues. So a company should be evaluating where to respond, where to act, and prioritizing areas where the company can truly address the issue and address it in a meaningful way. What does all of this mean for the future? We all, as companies, as individuals, probably have more to learn, more to build a body of knowledge, more conversations to be had internally and externally to our organizations. And as you see here in this quote, not every lane of the D&I highway works for everyone. As we just mentioned on the previous slide, it's about identifying the opportunities that stakeholders care about, where we can have the most change, focus on those, because it's not realistic for us to focus on everything. And so as we learn, as we continue to discuss diversity and inclusion and other equality issues, it's important we continue to learn, engage with our stakeholders, engage with our employees, give them a voice, and continue to drive that through the organization, how we respond, how we prioritize initiatives. So diversity and inclusion very much still at the forefront for many companies and will continue to be, and plenty more still here to be done. I'm going to turn it to my colleague Trent now to talk about our next two sections focused on internal communications and ESG. Trent?
Great. Thanks, Jason. If you want to go to the next slide there. It's interesting in this wave of the Reputation Council how much of what we talked about in internal communications in this instance is colored by the discussion of COVID-19 and of diversity and inclusion, really indicating that this is all part of a system. It's not individual pieces that we can talk about. So for instance, one of the things that our Reputation Council members said is that as the pandemic hit, their internal communications had to become much more empathetic, let's say. The CEO needed to show, and the leadership of the company needed to show that they understood what was going on with the employees and what they were going through. And where it was managed correctly, they were able to really build their culture, even while everybody was working from different locations and different places. There were so many conversations I had with Reputation Council members about how internal communications had really changed from this top-down, here's some announcements, here's what we're going to be doing, to a much more interactive system of checking in on people and making sure they were doing okay. And where people failed to do that, as you can see in the quote, it had real consequences in terms of being, if you were tone deaf to your employees and what they were going through, had bad consequences for the business. And part of that, if we go to the next slide, emerged in talking about the expanding social agenda among employees. So when you talk about diversity and inclusion, for instance, or COVID-19 or climate change, it's again not a matter of internal communications, it's a matter of employee engagement and giving your employees the opportunity to lead. I thought it was really important, as Jason mentioned in the D&I section, that you have to be on the same page with your employees. Otherwise, what you're doing just brings false, right? And so giving employees the ability to form affinity groups helps to build culture. It helped people get through the pandemic. It helped people when they were working away from each other to be able to get into like-minded groups and discuss, what was going on. And we've seen a lot of companies moving towards this model of addressing not internal communications, but instead employee engagement. And we see this also in our global surveys. So these come from our global advisor study, which is conducted in 30 countries around the world. This first data point is from March of this year. So 68% of adults in that global study agreed that if businesses didn't act to combat climate change, they would be failing their employees and customers. Climate and ESG, which is the next section we're going to talk about, part of the reason that that is on the agenda of companies is because it's important to their employees. The second piece of information comes from a study across the G7, and you can see that 55% of adults in that study support laws banning discrimination against LGBTQ plus people in terms of employment, education, and housing. Another tie to your employee engagement and to diversity and inclusion. And then finally, again, from our global advisor study, 79% of adults agree that reducing gender inequalities benefits society as a whole. And as Jason noted in his section on D&I, our reputation council members are in vast agreement with us that the more you can do to promote diversity and inclusion, the more you do to build your business. And then finally, as I've alluded to, internal communications, the other big trend is this idea of employee advocacy. In some ways, employees will lead on this because you can't do things as a business without the support of your employees, especially when you want to go beyond the basics of your core business. And as we work to kind of align what goes on externally and internally, this has to be taken into account. If a business is saying something externally that the employees don't believe is actually happening, you end up with situations where you have employee whistleblowers, indicating that the company isn't living up to its promises or living up to what it says about social impact, for instance. And that's a situation that you want to avoid, and you avoid that situation by engaging employees as part of the process and building these systems, but also in terms of being aligned in what you're doing and saying both internally and externally. We'll now go to our final section for today is on ESG, or environment, social, and governance, or sustainability. You can use all of those words. This involved a lot of discussion with our Reputation Council members. Overwhelmingly, people agree that ESG is important to the investors in their company and to other stakeholder groups. So this is overwhelming agreement, near 80% for both. Reputation Council members are a little less confident that it matters to customers or to the general public. While this is sustainability is a boardroom topic, it's not necessarily a kitchen table topic yet. And we've seen this also in our broader sustainability work, where unless you really define it for people and make it concrete, they really don't know what it means. I would say that in many cases, the general public is about 10 years behind companies in terms of understanding the sophistication of a response to sustainability. For vast amounts of the general public right now, it's still about recycling or using less or whatever. they don't see the whole picture of sustainability. And so in that way, when we look at the key considerations in ESG, a lot of this is about how it applies with stakeholders. So if we go to the next one. So, what do our stakeholders expect, both internal and external? So again, when we come back to this idea that employees are one of the key stakeholders here. And then, is it a reputational gain or is it a regulatory risk? That's another consideration when our Reputation Council members are looking at sustainability. There's also a lot of concern in the communications professional community around inconsistency in approaches and reporting for companies. There's a feeling that there's still not kind of a standard, even with the UN SDG reporting requirements and things. It's still a murky environment. And as we mentioned, this is something that's important at the boardroom level because it's about how do you align your ESG activities with your overall business strategy in order to make them something that is authentic to people. Another point that we saw, in ESG, a lot of people have mainly assumed that it's about the environment. But what COVID-19 has indicated or has pushed is this idea that it's more about the S. It's about the impact on society rather than just the impact on the environment. And as I've said a few different times, the employees are a top priority when it comes to communicating about ESG. So if we go into stakeholder expectations, it's, again, it's about the board and investors and suppliers. There's an entire ecosystem of people, according to our Reputation Council members, who are paying more attention to ESG commitments and to the actions that companies are taking. You'll note that in that quote there, that customers are in it, but not really, it's much more considered to be this upper level stakeholder engagement that's important on ESG. And part of that is because when you look at the next slide on reputation regulatory risks, there's this idea that you have to have accountability and transparency, right? And that more organizations and more different stakeholder groups are requiring this from each company. And so you have to think about, what are the risks that we're managing, but also how can we move forward in a positive way. And then, as I mentioned, if we look at the next slide, you have this idea that the pandemic has triggered this greater focus on the social part of ESG and given companies really an opening to talk more about their social impacts rather than just environmental impacts. And we do have some consumer data that backs this up. So if we look at the next slide, what we did was, this is a multinational study, again, on our Global Advisor platform across 30 markets. And we asked people about the role of multinational companies. And rather than using the standard definition of ESG, we actually came up with, through various qualitative exercises, definitions of E, S, and G that are more pertinent to people at the general public level. And overall, if you try to rank these things 1 to 3, which one's most important, second most important, third most important, society comes out on top by just a little bit when you look at the means, but by quite a lot when you look at the proportion of people who say that it is first. So 41% of people across countries rank society first rather than environment. And this was a bit of a a bit of a shock, really, when we got this research back, to see that this idea that it's about improving society has more traction than improving the environment. We then dug into each of these areas of ESG just to try to get some guidance on what people want, right? And so what people want, when they think about environmental concerns globally, it's about reducing waste and pollution first and foremost. It has the most top 3 votes of any of the other items. And then it's reducing plastic use and products, less about addressing climate change or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I think this is in part because what we asked was, what is the role of multinational companies? And so when you ask about climate change, more people tend to think that's the role of government than it is the role of companies. So that's probably why that's lower down on the list. If we look at the next slide in terms of societal concerns, there are 2 things that really stand out that people want multinational companies to do, and that's improving worker conditions and improving worker health and safety. And boy, does this just turn right back around to what we were talking about in terms of internal communications and diversity and inclusion too. The pandemic has brought home to people that workers are people too, and the extent to which companies take care of their workforce is an indication of how good a company they are overall. And so taking care of your workforce is very important. And I think that's particularly important for companies in the US to keep in mind as we go through this, the great resignation, they're calling it, with people walking out the door on jobs that are no longer supporting them. If you don't take care of your employees, you are at great risk of damaging your reputation. When it comes to corporate governance, there's one concern that stands about all the others, and that's ending corruption and bribery, and then paying their fair share of taxes. Those are really the things from a governance perspective that people want from multinational corporations. And so when we think about, I think I've already pounded this topic home in terms of the role of employees. Your employees expect your ESG commitments to be employee driven. They want to make, they want to have a chance to lead on this. And it's about, making them ambassadors about of your efforts by involving them in the upfront. So a few do's and don'ts that come out of our Reputation Council interviews again. Identify material issues, which means, take action that really impacts your business. Because by taking on those actions that impact your business, and number 1, and number 2, those give you credibility. I think the other thing that came through in our interviews was that companies really need to think big when it comes to ESG. You can do a lot of small things, or you can do one big thing and do it well. And the communicators in our Reputation Council think that taking on one big item is the way that you can then show impact, so that you can measure and report that impact. And it will help you then to communicate effectively to the right audiences, because you will have something to show them. And this is actually pretty consistent from what we've seen in other years. So if we look at the next slide, this comes from our 14th sitting of the Reputation Council. And at the time, Reputation Council members were talking about making CSR integrated, rigorous, and genuinely aligned. And it's the same thing that we're seeing now. That hasn't changed over time. But if you want to simplify this, it really comes down to 3 things. So if we look at the next one, it comes down to being authentic, credible, and effective with your ESG or sustainability programs. Authenticity can be thought of as that which comes from within. Are you being in line with your company in brand values? Are you in line with what your employees think and are willing to act on? Is it something that is a material issue per the other slide, in that does it impact your business? Because all of those things will make it more credible. So are you then aligning what you can do authentically, there it is, as a business with what impacts the world? So that is your external forces, then determine your credibility in that area. If you try to take action on something that people either don't think that you're capable of doing, or that they have no understanding of why that's important to your business, then it won't be credible. And finally, are you effective in terms of making an actual difference in the world? So effectiveness, can be about just creating goodwill, but you also have to be able to show that. You have to have a real business impact in order to be considered effective. And so you do those things on our last slide here by understanding your value chain, how sustainability topics link with what your company does, working from the inside out in many ways to form your programs, and then making sure that you measure that impact over time. So are the things that you're doing have a real measurable impact in the community or on the topic you wish to address? And then you can communicate your findings, because you'll have something to stand on when it comes to your sustainability activities. And eventually this becomes a cycle where your communication with stakeholders helps you then to adapt those programs going forward, so it has more impact on your business as well as on your stakeholder attitudes. And so that wraps up our topics of discussion for today. I know that we've been taking questions in the chat, so we're going to see what we have there. And Jason, I'm going to hand it back to you to moderate that portion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Trent. So again, I encourage anybody to submit questions into the chat. Trent, I do have two here. Well, the first is around the COVID section. How do we see things evolving as more companies do really begin to return to work? And I'm happy to address that one on that section. So I think that we're going to see a lot of learning and readjusting. Employees, of course, have grown accustomed and have always demanded more flexibility. And we're seeing that the ability to work virtually, the ability to work in hybrid environments, and this greater flexibility has shown that we can still be effective, that we can still be productive throughout all of this. Beyond the Reputation Council, Ipsos has been exploring this in a number of different research studies. So we've got additional data available we'd be happy to share afterwards. But we are seeing from a company perspective the need for that flexibility and meeting employees at least partially where they are. What we're going to see, of course, is that continuous learning and evolution as we all emerge from the pandemic and companies implement new policies, new tools, new methods of engaging. But it's about making sure, of course, that employees have a voice, employees' needs and expectations are heard. Trent, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, and I think it's also keeping the momentum that many companies have built around these affinity groups, and keeping those affinity groups going even once we're back in person, and even once people aren't craving contact like they were during the height of the pandemic, being able to keep those going, because those in turn strengthen the business and inform the communications of the company.
Excellent. The second question I see here is around diversity and inclusion. So that point about fear of saying the wrong thing, if there's a fear of saying the wrong thing, what should companies be doing? I think here it leads a lot into what Trent was also talking about on ESG, right? diversity and inclusion falls under that in some regards as a societal expectation of employees and other stakeholders for the ways in which companies operate. And so as we heard in that last section, it's really about ensuring employees have a voice, that they are heard, their needs and their expectations are genuinely considered in the different commitments and initiatives that companies are launching. So it's really about listening, understanding employee and other stakeholder needs, and really focusing on action. It's that authentic, credible, and effective framework that's not just for the broader ESG components, but also for diversity and inclusion. What are those expectations from stakeholders that we can authentically contribute to, create policies, and create a framework to address, that we can credibly address as a business, and that we can demonstrate impact or effectiveness against. So it all lines up with that and how we take a step in the right direction in terms of addressing these issues. Trent, again, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, well, and I think specifically on D&I, it's about following the employees' leads in many cases. There will be groups of employees who want to lead on this issue, and the more that you follow the employee leads on these issues, the more likely it is to be something that's authentic.
Absolutely. Those are the only 2 questions currently in the chat. So if there are no further questions, we do have on this last slide, of course, our contact information. I encourage you to reach out to Trent and or myself with any other follow-ups. If anything else does come through, we're happy to address those by email, of course. And we encourage you to also visit our site, reputation.ipsos.com, to see more of the research studies that we have conducted, learn a little bit more about our corporate reputation practice.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I want to thank you both for your super interesting presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today. If we did not get to your question, then we will do so by email. And you will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. And of course, as these guys said, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you. So please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.